At the end of every message, we ask you this question. What's one thing you heard today that you want to apply to your life this week? So always asking ahead of time to consider this, to take notes. We'd encourage you to take notes. If you don't have something to do that with, there's little note cards on the seats in front of you. If you need a Bible, there's Bibles on the chairs in front of you. In fact, if you borrow a Bible, it's on page 488. Thank you, Noah. I appreciate it. A little support there. All right. He found it. He said he beat me there. I could tell. Yeah. Kids, you've got 5 questions to follow along with. If you are here today and you're looking around, you see the kids are in by choice. We keep our kids with our families. We believe that family discipleship is best done together. And so parts of this will speak to the kids, part of this we're speaking to everybody. In fact, the stuff that's for the kids actually pretty good for all of us, to be fair. So if you're trying to find the answer to those 5 questions, you're on track. Today we have a psalm that's going to begin with an imperative, again, kind of like last week, and then it's going to take us through a series of stories from the Old Testament. It's literally going to take us from mid-Genesis through Exodus, some of the law, Joshua into the land, Judges, a little season in the Judges, and then to some of the promises made in 1 Samuel. And so the psalm that we're looking at today is kind of a historical psalm. We'll see how that breaks down. Before we get there, I want to give you the main idea. We'll put the main idea and the main points on the screen today. So here it is. Teach the next generation. Psalm 78 is a song calling us to teach the next generation how God provides for his people while purging from among them those who do not remain faithful. So here's the idea. God is faithful, provides for the faithful, and purges from among them those who are unfaithful. If you'd write that down, we'll leave it up there for a couple minutes. I'm going to come back to that. And so I'm going to hit that a couple times a day. So I'd encourage you. Psalm 78 is a song, as all the Psalms are. They're meant for singing corporately. But it's to teach the next generation how God provides for his people while purging from among them those who do not remain faithful. This kind of dual focus. God faithfully provides and purges from among the people those who are not faithful. Psalm 78. Let's pick up in verse 1 with a little introduction. A maskil of Asaph. He begins with, "Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth." So let's do a little introduction. Kids, your first 2 answers are coming up in here. Psalm 78 is a historical psalm. Said that. So it's a psalm about history. Now, I was trying to think, and maybe some of you, especially those of you who know more hymns than I do, I'm trying to think if there's many historical songs that we sing today, other than psalms. This was more common in the Psalms to sing about their history, and that's what's going to happen in Psalm 78 today. And I was just thinking, I can't name a single song that really kind of even reflects, like even if we look on the last 500 years since the Reformation, right? Since God, through some faithful leaders, rescued us from going off the rails in Roman Catholicism, right? I'm just looking at how God rescued and saved his church by some leaders that did some incredible things to kind of get us back on track. Or even the early years of the church, kind of the apostolic, Nicene, ante-Nicene, post-Nicene era, where the church was really staying in shape. I just can't think of a lot of historical things that we sing. And so this is probably a category of psalm that we're used to reading if we read through the Psalms, but aren't necessarily used to singing. So it's a historical psalm. Asaph is our author. Unlike the half of them that are written by David, Asaph is actually a worship leader in David's court. So he's a musician and a singer and a songwriter who serves under David during King David's reign, making the audience, obviously, the people of God under King David. You with me? So Asaph lives alongside King David, who raised him up, put him in charge of many musicians, singers, and songs, and he's a songwriter writing songs for the people of God. And then again, the 2 big themes today: God is faithful to provide for his people, and God purges the unfaithful from among his people. So we're going to ask these questions. How do these two themes relate to Asaph's audience, the people? And then, of course, how do they relate to us? Starting back in verse 1. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old. So give ear to my teaching, right? It's also a teaching, an instruction psalm. When we looked at Psalm 119, we looked at a few sections of it, right? It's it's the longest psalm, the longest chapter in the whole Bible. When we looked at how it's written to instruct, right? Families use that. If you remember the 8 verses per stanza, first 8 verses started with the Hebrew letter Aleph, right? The second 8 verses in the second stanza all start with the letter Bet, right? Gimel, Dalet, Ha, right? It moves through the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet. And they would use this kind of like we do, little kids do. I'm sure Dawn does in her kindergarten class, like A is for apple, B is for whatever, right? You get that, using that kind of alliteration. Well, they did that through singing. And I'm sure there's better ones. Sorry, I probably let you down in that. Okay, so I'm sure there's better ways. But as they would do that, they would also be teaching them God's word simultaneous to teaching them to read and to speak and letters and things like that. So this is one that's going to instruct in the history of God. So he says, I will open my mouth in a parable, utter dark sayings from of old. That sounds weird to us. It sounds like he's intentionally being confusing. But he's using the rhetorical styles of the day. Parables actually are stories. Literally, the Greek word means to throw in alongside. It's a story thrown in alongside something, right? A physical story to teach us a spiritual meaning. A lot of the parables in the Bible have to do with shepherding or growing crops or things they all did. If we were going to use parables today, we'd have to switch the metaphors to things we understand. Parables were meant to be understood, and when you understood something in story fashion, then it stuck with you longer. And so he's saying, I'm going to teach you in such a way that it'll stick as we work through and sing through this psalm. So again, it's a teaching psalm focusing on their history. So let's put it all together. Verse 3. Things that we have heard and known that our fathers have told us. So how'd they learn it? From their fathers, right? Verse 4. We will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation. So what are they supposed to do with it? Tell the next generation. What are they supposed to tell them? The glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders that he has done. Clearly, the work of God is the content here. Now, I want to say that again. The author is instructing the reader, really, if you're thinking about what they were singing, what they were learning, is instructing the reader to take the things that are known and to teach the next generation. I'm going to pass this on. Now, next generation could be our children. Again, we value that here. We are intentional about that here. Right? We disciple our kids with purpose here. But the next generation are also those, like many of you, who have come to faith here. Right? So passing this on not just to our kids, but to those who come to faith here. We should be instructing. But the content is specific here. The glorious deeds of the Lord and his might, the wonders that he has done. As we get into the histories, we're going to see a lot about what the people do. But that's not the point. It's what God is doing in this passage. We're going to see why and what the people do. You with me? You get the difference, right? We're looking at the works of God. We're looking at the character of God. We're looking at these two things, how God is faithful to those who are faithful and how God purges the unfaithful from among them. We're looking at those two things that God does. When we see what the people do, we're just seeing the surrounding setting, why God is doing what he's doing. Our job is not to focus on the people, but to focus on the work of God. One more quick note, I want to read verse 4. We will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might, the wonders that he has done. Again, I want you to hear that. Our emphasis today is on what God is doing. And that's important sometimes because of us. We might get caught up in what we are doing or what we are enduring or what we are going through or how we're falling short or how we're doing well or how so-and-so is doing or this or that. When really our eyes need to lift up a little more to what God is doing. Verse 5. Let's get into the content now of the instruction. Verse 5, he, meaning God, established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children. So God established a testimony. He's talking about in Jacob. Now, you can look all the way back to the man Jacob, who becomes the man Israel, right? And the people that come from it. So God established a testimony, a witness to who he is in a person and in people. And then he commanded, it says, our fathers to teach their children, that the next generation might know. Children not even born yet, arise and will tell them when they're born to their children who are clearly not born yet either. So here's kind of the first point today. Number one, teach the next generation. Psalm 78 gives us an imperative to teach the next generation about the works of God, including children, our biological kids, and converts. We'll just call that our spiritual kids. When I say our biological kids, and those who come to faith here, those who come to faith in Jesus through the church. So that's kind of the first thing. There's an imperative to teach the next generation. Verse 5. I want to kind of get a running start into verse 7. So we'll back up and catch these two verses again. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach their children that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children, right? Teach the next generation. Listen, so that, verse 7, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the work of God, but keep his commandments. And that they should not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. If verses 5 and 6 are what should be done, verses 7 and 8 are the reason to do it, right? Here, teach them so that they will not be like them, but rather be obedient. So here's what to do. Why? In the positive, so that they will set their hope in God. They will not forget the works of God. They will keep his commandments. There's the why do it in the positive sense. Now, why in the negative? So they would not be like their fathers, the earlier generations, who were stubborn and rebellious and who were not faithful to God. One more time in verse 8. And that they should not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. Kids, for you, question number 3. You're on your own after that. I want you to see this, and I want all of us to see this. There's a repetition that begins in verse 8, and that is kind of carried throughout this long psalm. I think it's 72 verses. He calls an earlier generation stubborn and rebellious, and it begins a series of repeated terms that have the words sin, rebel, and test in them, describing this group that came before, this group of people that are not faithful to God. These are the people that ultimately we're going to see God purges from among the community. But this use of sin, rebellion, and testing comes up over and over again. All right, on to Asaph telling the story of the prior generation. So here's the history, starting in verse 9. The Ephraimites, armed with the bow, turned back on the day of battle. They did not keep God's covenant, but refused to walk according to his law. The Ephraimites are descendants of Joseph. If you remember back, they all move into Egypt. Things are good. Israel, his sons, go into Egypt. God calls 12 tribes from there. But Jacob skips blessing his son Joseph, right? Joseph's now second in charge in Egypt. You guys all know this story. He's one of the most powerful men on the planet. So Israel, Jacob, his father, goes to bless his other sons, but he gives a double blessing to Joseph by skipping him and taking his 2 sons and blessing the 2 of them. They become tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim. Well, later, if you follow the story out, Ephraim disobeys God, does not remember the covenant, doesn't care about the other tribes, doesn't go to war with them, violating God's commands. Verse 11, they forgot his works and the wonders that he had shown them. Right, we saw this again. Verse 7, so you don't forget. Now we have it in verse 11, they forgot. Right? So why is forgetting, or what is he talking about? Why is forgetting our past so important here? Right? This isn't like I forgot my keys at home and I need whatever. This is like I don't keep what God has done in the forefront of my mind. It's not a forgetfulness like, oh, I left my wallet or something, right? This is I'm not constantly keeping the work of God in front of me. When they forget what he did, they're not keeping an intentional view of what God does and what God has done. The prior generation forgot what God had done with them, all the ways that he had cared for them. So I want to give us kind of the second point, and we're going to see this unpacked verse after verse after verse today. So second thing, remembering is the key to obedience. We're to keep what God has done in history and in our own lives in the front of our minds, so it helps prevent us from sinning against God. One great way to remember and to not forget is to sing the songs that remind us, right? That's why they had these historical psalms, was to remember the activity that God had done. Remember the works of God. Since we're a little light in that, and I can't think of examples for us where we do that, we're going to have to learn how to do that better. Remembering what God has done. So remembering how God saved you. Remembering the stories of how God has saved people throughout history. It's one of the things I enjoy when I'm not working is to read biographies, autobiographies or biographies, especially of Christian. I mean, read all kinds of them, but specifically of Christian leaders throughout history. And to hear what God did in their lives and through them, how God moved in different cultures, is an encouragement. It reminds us of how God acts, who God is, what God does. And remembering those things actually helps prevent us from forgetting God and prevents us from falling into sin. Remembering who God is and telling of that helps keep us on track. Now we're going to move through a big section of history, verse 12. In the sight of their fathers, he performed wonders. In the land of Egypt, in the fields of Zoan, he divided the sea and let them pass through it. He made the water stand like a heap. In daytime, he led them with a cloud, and all the night a fiery light. He split rocks in the wilderness. He gave them drink abundantly as from the deep. He made the streams come out of the rock and caused waters to flow down like rivers. So here in this section, we move from Egypt, where they're in slavery, through the Exodus into the wilderness, right? He divided the sea and let them pass through it. We're talking about the deliverance of Israel as he moves them through the Red Seas. He parts the sea and lets them walk through on dry land. And then as the army is chasing them to kill them, the sea collapses on them, saving them. It says in the daytime, he led them with a cloud. They're literally wandering around through a wilderness, and he gives them shade in the daytime, right? He is with them. God's presence is with the people. It says, and all the night with a fiery light. I'm going to remind our men of this next weekend when we're camping together in the retreat. When it's super dark out, I want to come back and read this verse. All the night, this fiery light stood with them, right? I can imagine light out in the wilderness with predatory animals and all the very, very darkness of being out there. And God's light literally is his presence with them. He split rocks and gave them water. Again, they're out in the desert with no water, and he literally brings water from a rock. It says he made streams come out of the rock and caused waters to flow down like rivers. Can you even imagine? So these are the things. This is just a short list of the things that those who went through the Exodus got to see, and there's more coming. But these are some pretty powerful things that these people got to see God do for them on their behalf, literally saving them from the Egyptian army, literally giving them water from a rock. I don't even know where to begin with that. Presence of God in the daytime and a cloud at night, a fire. So you got to ask, so how do the people honor God for doing all that? Let's keep reading verse 17. Yet they still sinned more against him, rebelling against the Most High in the desert. Listen to that. Yet they still sin more. against him, rebelling against the Most High in the desert. They tested God in their heart by demanding the food they craved. So God delivered them, gave them miraculous water, shade, light, presence, lots of other stuff. His presence among them, right? Lots of other stuff. And then they cry about not having food. Now it's easy. It's easy to throw stones at this point, right? It's easy to look at, in fact, it's hard not to ask the question, like, you saw that and then did this? And get a little judgy, right? But are we any different? That's the problem, right? We're human, as Solomon would say, there's nothing new under the sun. They see these miraculous things. We've seen these amazing things of God in us as I look around at people and I know the stories, like I've seen amazing things. I've seen God move in my life, in your life, in your life. And yet, I still sin. Yet I still forget God. Instead, I go my own way. So when we look at them, it's easy from the outside to get a little judgy, right? We got to place ourselves in the text. Verse 19. They spoke against God, saying, "Can God spread a table in the wilderness? He struck the rock so that water gushed out and the streams overflowed. Can he also give bread or provide meat for his people?" Listen to the question. Not will he, can he? Like, he got water from a rock. Can he give us bread and meat? And it says they're complaining. They're not just praying and asking. They're sinning, rebelling, and complaining. And the can is kind of a doubting God, as if they've seen all these things. And I've got to imagine at times, because this happens in the wilderness, this happens either under the cloud or the pillar of fire. And again, easy to get judgy, and yet that's us. Can he do this too? Next stanza is a long one. Let's read it all at once. Verse 21. Therefore, when the Lord heard, he was full of wrath. A fire was kindled against Jacob. His anger rose against Israel. When you read Jacob, sometimes it means the man Jacob, right? Typically pre-conversion, right? Before he wrestles with God and God calls him Israel and kind of goes from Jacob, which kind of has the connotation like con artist. Israel, which means governed by God. Those two words have that meaning, right? Jacob literally means heel catcher, but it's like a euphemism for con artist. He becomes Israel, one who's governed by God. So it can mean the man, but a lot of times, like right here, it's not talking about the man. It's talking about the people. I can't prove this. I haven't done and it uses both terms here, so take it with a grain of salt if you will. A lot of times when he's calling the people Jacob, he's speaking about them in their sin. Right? He's kind of referring back to this piece of who he was before he was this. And here it uses both, Jacob and Israel, but typically that's the implication. Verse 21, let's start over there again. Therefore, when the Lord had heard, he was full of wrath. A fire was kindled against Jacob, that's the people. His anger rose against Israel because they did not believe in God and did not trust in his saving power. So God starts out rightfully angry, but listen to the next word, right? Yet he commanded the skies above and opened the doors of heaven. And he rained down on them manna to eat and gave them the grain of heaven. Man ate the bread of the angels. There's a line to remember. He sent them food in abundance. Literally, if you don't know what manna is, God from the sky brought down this dew that hardened up and became bread called manna. Every morning, bread on the ground. That's what it was. Verse 26. He caused the east wind to blow in the heavens, and by his power he let out the south wind. He rained meat on them like dust, winged birds like the sand of the seas. He literally delivered birds to them like a divine Uber Eats, right? Chicken, right? Birds to eat meat to their tent flaps, right? He let them fall in the midst of their camp, verse 28, all around their dwellings. Verse 29, and they ate and they were filled, for he gave them what they craved. God gave them bread from heaven, manna, and meat to eat. Verse 30, but before they had satisfied their craving, while the food was still in their mouths, the anger of God rose against them, and he killed the strongest of them, and he laid low the young men of Israel. Tough ending, right? So God provides bread And if you know the story, there's a lot to it. But manna, daily, trusting in Him, only gathering what you need for that day, except for the day before the Sabbath where you'd gather enough for 2 days so you wouldn't work on the Sabbath, right? This learning to daily trust in God. Meat literally delivers the birds to them like chickens flying to your door, knocking and like, hey, I'm here, right? He does this. But then He also wipes out some of the disobedient people. I want to give you this third point today. Number 3, God will not overlook sin. God provides generously for His people, but does not overlook sin. We cannot test God by ignoring His generous care for us without expecting discipline to follow. Now, we're reading a pretty short story. We went from mid-Genesis with Jacob, who becomes Israel, which is in like the chapters, the 30s, right? All the way through the Exodus into the wilderness, right? Like we're moving through this in minutes. But what's taking place here is years, if not decades. And so of time, as time goes by, as He is providing, as God's provision is like not only visible and present with them, but they're moaning and groaning throughout this season and not remembering His goodness that is still with them as they begin to complain. And so by the time God gets around to disciplining the community and removing the problem from among them, you understand a lot of time has gone by. Listen to the very next stanza, verse 32. In spite of all this, they still sinned. Despite His wonders, they did not believe. So they literally reject God on purpose. I had to look these up. Spite and despite. I use those terms all the time. And I kind of know, but every once in a while, I think, Chris, you did this in your message a couple weeks ago. You're just like, I know the word, but I'm going to look this up. There's meaning in there that I want to make sure I got my head around. Spite. It says, in spite of all this, they still sin. Spite is defined as the desire to hurt, annoy, or offend. Out of their desire to hurt, annoy, or offend God, they still sinned. Despite His wonders, they did not believe. Despite is defined as without being affected by. Without being affected by the very bread showing up every morning and meat every night, without being affected by the cloud cover or the light over the top of you, without being affected by God's presence among you or the water coming out of rocks, they decided they didn't believe. In spite of, despite. Like they're in the middle of this. They're not in some season right now where everything's going wrong. Yeah, they're in the desert, but they're not enslaved anymore. And if they'd be a little more obedient, God would take them into the land. But in spite of all that, despite of that, verse 32, in spite of all this, they still sinned. Despite His wonders, they did not believe. So He made their days vanish like a breath and their years in terror. There's 3 parts to this. I want to keep this in view. God is faithful. The people are sinful in response. God purges the sinful from among them, right? We see His faithfulness, food, drink, cloud cover, fire, light. We see their sin in response, yet they still sinned. In spite of all this, they still sinned. Despite this, they continue to sin. So then, God purges the unfaithful. Listen to the cycle that's repeated, verse 34. When He killed them, they sought Him. They repented and sought Him earnestly. They remembered, there's that word again, right? Remembering what God has done. They remembered that God was their rock, the Most High God, their Redeemer. This sounds positive, but you got to keep reading. Listen to the next verse, verse 36. They flattered Him with their mouths. They lied to Him with their tongues. Their heart was not steadfast toward Him. They were not faithful to His covenant. They go from remembering to forgetting pretty quickly. Verse 38. Yet He, being compassionate, atoned for their iniquity and did not destroy them. He restrained His anger often and did not stir up all His wrath. He remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes and comes not again. Right? God is good and grace-filled. He's atoning for them, but they are continually going the other way. And this part, at least this part, like you can, if you're reading, and sometimes it's a discipline to figure out like how much time goes by between this verse and this verse, right? Sometimes as we're reading, and we're reading it pretty quickly, it feels like no time goes by. It's like this, and it just like happens. We're talking about a span of years here. And this verse kind of expands some of it and lets you see how God is providing. They're sinning, God is atoning for them and forgiving them, and they're still sinning. God provides, and then finally he gets around to the discipline. This little section right here is a reference. It's kind of a subtle reference to the book of Judges. When I taught Old Testament history at the high school, we talk about the cycle of the book of Judges. And it goes like this. God blesses people, and then what we see is them sin pretty quickly, right? That it goes from their blessing, they're doing well, they forget about God, into sin. And then God disciplines them, removes his blessing, or lets the nations come in around them and start pressuring them. And then they repent and turn to God, and when they do, he blesses them again, and then they sin again, and like it's just this cycle, right? It's just kind of this sin cycle, forgiveness, discipline, repentance, blessing, sin, repetition. And I think it's kind of the whole book of Judges is this spiral, right? And we read it, and from the outside, we're like, oh, wish they'd just get it. We get awful judgy, right? And so again, then we got to consider us. And I just think of, there's so many stories of people that kind of come through the doors when they're struggling in life. Maybe a relationship has blown up, or a job, or something's happened, and people show up, right? And they plug in. Like they're here every Sunday. They start showing on Wednesday nights. They're getting discipled. They're doing this. They're doing that. They're serving. But then, and they're praying, like, God, I need a job, or God, I'm lonely. I want a spouse, or whatever it might be. And they're praying, and when God starts to show up and provide that, then all of a sudden they're too busy dating to come to church, or they're too busy working to show up, and they forget, right? And when we see them again, right? When everything kind of crumbles on the other side of it. And it's just like this in modern day terms. Because it's kind of how we're built in sin. If we don't remember what God is doing, keeping that in front of us, then we forget, and we begin to act in ways against God. So Asaph continues, verse 40. How often they rebelled against him in the wilderness and grieved him in the desert. They tested God again and again and provoked the Holy One of Israel. There's those repeated words like sin, rebellion, testing again, right? Verse 42. They did not remember his power. Again, remember, keeping this all in front of them. They did not remember his power, or the day when he redeemed them from the foe, when he performed signs in Egypt and his marvels in the fields of Zoan. So what are the people to learn from Asaph here today? Right? And what are we to learn? What is for his audience, the people that he's writing to in David's day, that he's going to lead them in singing, and what are we supposed to learn, right? We're supposed to remember what God has done. This remember, do not forget, right? Keep this in the front of our brains, actively remembering, dwelling on who God is and what God has done for us, so that it drives us and it reminds us. Here's some history from Asaph. He's going to walk through this section, see if you can kind of figure out what he's talking about. It's pretty easy. Verse 44, he turned their rivers into blood so that they could not drink their streams. He sent among them swarms of flies which devoured them, and frogs which destroyed them. He gave their crops to the destroying locust, and the fruit of their labor to the locust. He destroyed their vines with hail and their sycamores with frost. He gave over their cattle to the hail, and their flocks to thunderbolts. He let loose on them his burning anger, wrath, indignation, and distress, and a company of destroying angels. He made a path for his anger. He did not spare them from death, but gave their lives over to the plague. He struck down every firstborn in Egypt. I'm sure you're picking it up where we are now. The first fruits of their strength and the tents of Ham. The part of history that Asaph is reminding is about how God judged the people who were persecuting them and enslaving them, how God judged Egypt. So he kind of walks through that season of the 10 plagues, finishing up with the death of the firstborn in each home, in every Egyptian home, and anybody who didn't have the blood painted on their doors. So the 10 plagues in Egypt. And again, can you even imagine seeing all those things take place? There's a fascinating story. If you want to read from I think it starts in Exodus 6 or 7, and it goes through to 13 where the Passover is. And it goes through these 10 plagues. And it's fascinating to look at the plague and then look at what happens to the people, not just the Israelites, because the Israelites are fairly obedient at this point. Moses goes in, says, this is going to happen. There's going to be hail. Go inside. They all go inside. Take your animals inside. They all do it. But after this plague, right around the middle, 4, 5, 6, the Egyptians start doing the things Moses is telling the Israelites to do. They're like, go inside, we're going inside. They went inside, we're going inside. And all of a sudden they start to live. Then after that final 10th plague with the death of the firstborn son or animal in every house, they literally pay Israel to leave. Israel's slaves, they're broke, they're poor. But because of that 2-3 years of plagues, they leave wealthy. And read those last lines as they exit. Egyptians and other people follow them out. They begin to see God. They begin to remember who God is and keep that in front of them, and it leads them out. And Asaph is reminding them here what God does to those who persecute his people. So when they're looking at the surrounding nations and they're fearful of it, he's reminding them, listen, God's already done this. So when they move from the wilderness to the promised land, and they have to remove the Amalekites and the Hittites and all the other ites, right? That they remember that it's God that does it. Again, can you imagine seeing all this? Then we've got to zoom back out and think of, look at all God has shown us. So Asaph's going to pick up the pace of the history a little bit. Verse 52, then he led out his people like a sheep and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. He led them in safety so that they were not afraid, but the sea overwhelmed their enemies. So from the exodus from Egypt into the wilderness, crossing the Red Sea. Verse 54, and he brought them to his holy land, to the mountain which his right hand had won. That skips over 40 years in the wilderness. Now we're moving through the other sea into the promised land. Verse 55, he drove out nations before them. He apportioned them for a possession and settled the tribes of Israel in their tents. From the wilderness to the promised land, and the expulsion of all the other people in 4 verses, right? A real quick snapshot of how they got in. Let's see how they respond. Verse 56, yet they tested and rebelled against the Most High God and did not keep his testimonies, but turned away and acted treacherously like their fathers. They twisted like a deceitful bow. Again, the repetition. Tested, rebelled, and now acted treacherously. It's that cycle, and this is that section of the Judges again. God blesses them, God provides for them, God cares for them, God gives them the land, God displaces the people, and what do? They turn to foreign idols. They sin and rebel against God. So then God begins to discipline them. And it isn't until the discipline is painful enough to where they start to return to him and receive God's blessing again. And this cycle goes over and over and over. And again, it's easy to see it. It's easy to poke fun at. We do it too. So I want to get us out of this loop. I want to get us to the end so we can kind of finish this section. Verse 58. For they provoked him to anger with their high places, meaning the place where they worshipped idols. They moved him to jealousy with their idols. When God heard, he was full of wrath. He utterly rejected Israel. If you think about where we are in the book of Ezekiel, we return there on the 21st of this month. That's what it's talking about. They've been disobedient. God has rejected all of them. Verse 60, he forsook his dwelling at Shiloh, the tent where he dwelt among mankind, and delivered his power to captivity, his glory to the hand of the foe. He gave his people over to the sword and vented his wrath on his heritage. That's when he's saying, Babylon comes in and conquers them, Assyria first, then Babylon. Fire devoured their young men, and the young women had no marriage song. There's literally a passage in Ezekiel, read about that, where fire destroys a third of them in Jerusalem. Verse 64, their priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation. Then the Lord awoke as from sleep, like a strong man shouting because of wine. What a great line. And he put his adversaries to rout, and he put them to everlasting shame. So it goes from this repeated cycle, which is following kind of the kings that follow after Solomon, right? How they get worse and get worse. They divide into 2 nations, Israel and Judah. God conquers Israel through Assyria, end up conquering Judah mostly through Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, eventually conquering Jerusalem, where a lot of these verses kind of point to those things. The priest devoured by the sword, the fire that consumes the third, like all that stuff's what we've been reading about in Ezekiel before the summer. So here's point number 4 today. God is faithful but purges sin. God remains, can we put that one up, please? God remains faithful to his people because he's a good God, but he doesn't allow sin to corrupt everyone. God purges the sinful from the community, protecting his people from the corruption of sin. Right? God remains faithful. In fact, God's discipline in purging the corrupt people from among the community is him being faithful to his people. Getting rid of things before they infest everyone. It's like the removal of a cancer so that it doesn't consume the entire body. And so he purges people from amongst the community. Let's look at this final stanza, verse 67. He rejected the tent of Joseph. He did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, but he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loves. Now, I want to connect this to the gospel before we finish it up. I want to kind of, in simple terms, when we talk about the gospel each week, we never move on beyond the gospel. When we think about it just in simple terms, God created you and loves you. He made you, designed you. He gives us all purpose to be worshipers of his, meaning that our lives will bring glory to him. Now, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Sinned in Adam and Eve. We inherit that. We sin. We add to it. We understand that. And that sin separates us from God. And there's no going back to it. There's no way a sinful humanity can work their way up to a holy God. And so instead, God comes to us in Christ. God becomes flesh and lives among us. And he lives the life you and I are called to live but choose not to. And he lives it. And then in our place, to pay our penalty for our sin, Jesus dies on the cross. He's laid in the ground to cover our sin. He resurrects to give us new life. That if anyone is in Christ, he becomes a new creation. That resurrection gives us new life. Then Jesus, when the work was complete, ascends back to heaven where he reigns today, where he pours out his Spirit. We read in the Catechism this morning that all who believe receive the Spirit and will never lose it. Right? That we have that promise of the Holy Spirit in us. The very promise of baptism we talk about all the time. That's the gospel, that God has come to reconcile us to him. But the early church, when the early church would read passages like this, or when the early church would read through the Old Testament, what they would do is they kind of put it in categories. They kind of looked at the season of slavery like our life in sin before Jesus. And then they see the Exodus as kind of a teaching, a parallel, a type, a foreshadowing of our salvation in Christ. They saw the season of wilderness wandering, the 40 years that Israel spent in the wilderness, as our lives today, as we await the kingdom. And so the early church, the first century church, when they would read through these things, they kind of used it as a teaching or a type to understand us and our salvation in Jesus. We'll put this verse on the screen, but I want to read you Paul's words from 1 Corinthians 10. He says it like this, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers," he's talking about Israel in the wilderness, "were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized." Notice how he uses New Testament language for their crossing through the Red Sea. "Baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. All ate of the same spiritual food, and drank from the same spiritual drink." Talking about water from a rock, right? "They drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ." The first century church saw the entire Old Testament as teaching us, as they lived out their story, as teaching us theological truths about the gospel for our lives today. And so I want you to remember that. So then now that 40 years in the wilderness is like our lives today. So let's set that in that context. So what are we to do? Remember what God has done. Do not forget. See the things God has done. Keep this in front of us. Let's finish the text with that in mind. Verse 69. "He, God, built his sanctuary like the high heavens, like the earth, which he founded forever." Note the introduction of forever here, pointing us forward. Verse 70, "He chose David, his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the nursing ewes, he brought him to shepherd Jacob, his people. Israel was his inheritance. With an upright heart, he shepherded them and guided them with his skillful hand. See, our eyes turn to the era now of King David, beyond the wilderness and into the promised land, right? Beyond the wandering of that 40 years and into the land and past the bad kings and past the era of the judges and past the famine where Naomi leaves and comes back with Ruth, all those stories we know. And past the bad king Saul to the time where God chooses a leader in David to raise up and shepherd his people. And we know that David's not the hero of this story. It's the son of David in the New Testament, Jesus in flesh, that's our hero. Right? That he comes and shepherds his people. He says, I am the good shepherd. I don't lose any of my sheep. I hold them in my hand. No one can steal them out. If you are Christ, you're in his hand. He holds you. He keeps you. We start to point forward. And so when the early church read about the reign of David, though David is imperfect, they saw it about pointing us forward to the kingdom where we are with Christ. Because David is a type of Christ. David was the king. Jesus is the King of Kings. David received the promise that an heir from his biology, his family, his lineage would be the Messiah, Jesus. That's why the Gospels begin with those two different lineages, teaching us where Jesus comes from. That's why the blind man that follows Jesus around yells, Son of David, have mercy on me. Because David isn't there to read about David. David is there to point us forward to Christ. And David's kingdom, though imperfect, was kind of the pinnacle of faithfulness for Israel. After that, Solomon was good and then not, and his sons tanked it. And so this psalm reminds us, it pushes us forward. It teaches us to think of our lives as like in the wilderness now. It teaches us to remember what God has done. Remember who God is to us. Keep that in front of us while we wander. And that we should fix our eyes further down the road. So I want to give you a fifth note and point for the day. Look forward, but remember the past. Look to eternity to keep hope in our hearts. Look to the past to remember God's faithfulness over and above our sin. Live today in light of God's goodness, teaching the next generation about Jesus. We look to the past to remember how God has already done, what God has already done for us. We look to the past of our own lives. We look to the past of other lives. We look to the past in the church, how God has kept the church and protected the church. We look to the past of the Old Testament. We look to all of it. To all the places where we can see God's goodness and God's character. But then, when we have remembered who God is, to keep our hopes up, we look towards eternity. Because Jesus has secured for us an eternity. And if anyone is in Christ, he will arrive in eternity. So what applications will you make? What's something you heard today that you want to apply to your life this week? For myself, I've said this before. I don't look forward to eternity. I don't consider the future like eternity much. And I want to. I want to remember this. I want to be encouraged by the promises of Jesus and him restoring and fixing all things. Church members, your job is to teach the next generation, young and old, from the faithfulness of God in the past to the promises of God in the future. Help us tell the stories to the church. If you're new to the faith, learn. Don't take conversion as an arrival point. Let your faith today be simply a beginning and not a destination. You need to learn what God has done in order to remember what God has done. You must learn to remember. If you're not a follower of Jesus today, the gospel message is one that deals with life here on earth now and gives us a hope of a future. It's one that promises that because God is faithful, we have life. If that is new to you, any one of our elders would love to talk to you about that. Parents, kids, remember God by learning. Remember God by singing. Remember God's promises by looking forward to eternity in heaven. So what did you hear today that you want to apply to your life this week? Turn with someone around you. We're going to take 3 minutes, and I mean 3 minutes, y'all. 3 minutes to share that takeaway with others. So don't make your group too big. And if you're a part of this church and you see someone around you, don't let them get left out, please.